All right, my name is Thomas. I'm going to be refuting a Zachary's speech that said that the education system in the United States fails minority groups. He had three major claims. The first one was that the education system inadequately supports schools containing predominantly minorities. The education system fails to provide minorities with proper resources. And the third one was the education system practices methods that discourage minorities from going to school in the first place. For the first claim that he had, he used an article from Brookings, and unfortunately the article was published in 1998, and it mostly spoke about stuff that was going on between the 60s and almost the 2000s, and the gap between 1998 and today, 19 years, is too wide to apply the ideas from the article onto today's model. I don't think it's an accurate metric given the amount of time that's passed. For the second point, the advocate used a quote that said 91% of white children aged 3 to 5 who weren't enrolled in kindergarten were read to by family members 3 or more times per week. 78% of black children were read to with the same frequency. This was cited from a U.S. News article by Lindsay Cook. And first I'd like to say that being read to as a child is very good. First 5 California, woo. But it's not the school or the United States education system's responsibility to have parents read to their children. From the same exact news site, U.S. News, I found an article titled "Racial Gaps in High School Graduation Rates Are Closing" by Ali Bidwell. And she pointed out a trend, which I have further evidence for later, that graduation rates among minority groups are increasing at a greater rate than white graduation rates are increasing. So take that how you will. The third point was the education system practices methods that discourage minorities from going to school. The main claim for this one, or the main supporting evidence for this one, was that minority students and disabled students receive out-of-school attention at significantly greater rates than white students. This is going to come back. Well, not come back. This is not good. It's really bad. Out-of-school suspension it's great for kids. I mean, when I was in elementary school, I remember getting out-of-school suspension. Just like, whoo! Get a day off of school. It's awesome. But it's not good for society necessarily. So the biggest point about that is that out-of-school suspensions are given mostly because the school itself doesn't have the funds to have a teacher that can watch over the students. They don't have the funds for a in-school detention system. Now, this is where it gets fun. The reason that African American, Native American, and Hispanic students generally have higher rates of out-of-school detention are because they populate the lower income schools. Now, sure, there's something that can be done within the education system with diversifying funds between districts, of course. I think that this example is less of the education system failing minorities and more an example of the United States government failing to support minority communities across the board. And the failing of that is not, it doesn't lie on the education system, but it relies on the entire government across the board. I have some statistics from the National Center for Education Statistics. It takes the ACGR, which is this accumulated cohort graduation rate, which follows students who enroll in 9th grade, don't repeat it, and then graduate within 4 years. And it said that generally across the board, 82% of students graduate within 4 years. And then it breaks it down by racial groups from there. The only 2 groups that are above the base or the average line are whites at 87% and Asian and Pacific Islander at 89%. And then from there it goes down to Hispanic at 76%, Black at 73%, and Native American at 70%. Now, whether or not you would say that a graduation rate of 70% for a population from high school is failing or not, that's a different argument. I would say that, yes, the United States government has not supported minority communities in general, but it's not the education system that's failing them. It's, well, everything. So thank you.
All right, the structural stuff is fine at the beginning of the speech. On the first point, you've got a good criticism of the evidence that the advocate used and how it doesn't seem to be particularly timely since it's almost 20 years out of date. That's reasonable. I think one of the things that you might want to point out is that you had some information from more contemporary times talking about the graduation rates, for instance, and the gaps closing. If you put that together with the information that you had there, you could then generally say, we know that the circumstances are not the same 20 years later because here is what's going on contemporaneously, and I think that that would make your challenge to the evidence being old be more reasonable, because you can say, obviously things have changed because we've got this stuff going on. And then I think that would give you a little bit more backup for some of your argument on the third point. You do fall a little bit into some of the problems, accepting some of the problems that the advocates talked about. I can see how you're trying to parse it in that last section, but I think there's another way to do it. The second point I thought is a very straightforward reasoning issue. The responsibility of reading to your kids, that's not a school responsibility, that's not a government responsibility, that's a parent's responsibility. And unless this is a result of the lack of the education system teaching kids who become parents to read to their kids, that really shouldn't be something that's laid on the doorsteps of the education system. And I think it might have been useful to, like you mentioned, First Five or whatever it was, that we got all kinds of programs encouraging people to do that. There are public service announcements that do this kind of stuff. It's widely promoted that this is a good thing to do. So in essence, suggesting that if people are not taking advantage of it, it's not a result of a lack of information or attempts by the education system to provide this. It's somebody else's choice not to do those kinds of things. And then the third point, I think I understand your reticence to make an argument here that suggests that people are, not succeeding for some reason that's unrelated to their social status. I think that's the way you want to make the argument. It's social status and economics. It's not the school system that creates these problems. People are in all kinds of situations and circumstances where the conditions are not the same, and so there are going to be differences. And those differences are not necessarily reflected in... I like your explanation, for instance, about the in-school suspensions versus the out-of-school suspensions. If kids who are in minority groups go to school where they have less resources, the reason they're more likely to get an out-of-school suspension is because they don't have a teacher available to do the in-school suspension. So it's not so much that, the kids are getting treated differently in terms of being suspended or punished, but the kind of suspension they get is what's different. I like the idea of that. I wish you had a little bit more evidence on that to support that point, but I thought that was an interesting point. And then you do need to make a challenge that says, and an out-of-school suspension is not any worse than the regular kinds of suspensions that occur in school and detention. Now, from the kids' point of view, obviously, they feel differently about it. But
that was the hardest point to argue,
yeah,
because whenever I looked anything up for it regarding out-of-school suspensions, it's pretty much all pointed towards.
Yeah, well, you don't want kids out of school. You definitely don't want kids out of school. And that's more for a lot of reasons. A lot of reasons. Yeah, and it's tough on the families too. It's one of those things that becomes a problem. And then I like when you talk about the graduation rates I'm not exactly sure that having a gap is an important thing. One of the things that I thought was interesting, those earlier you'd said that the gap is closing. We don't get any data about what the school systems are doing about this. You kind of accept the premise that there is spending differentials, and I don't know that that's the case. Take the Los Angeles school system, for instance. What is their budget? How much do they spend per capita per pupil versus someplace else, for instance, that doesn't have the minority proportions that the LAUSD would have? That would be an easy way to make some comparison. I don't know. In California, maybe it's a little bit different, but for instance, in other parts of the country, I can't imagine that they're spending as much in their school districts as LAU Unified is spending, and that's a resource issue. That's the argument to be made there. Too long.